You are dead weight, a burden that ruined your daughter's life," my son-in-law shouted, applauded by the family. Everyone laughed at me during dinner. I just smiled and handed him an envelope. When he saw what was inside, his eyes nearly popped out of his face. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Marvin, and at 63 years old, I thought I had seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. The smell of roasted chicken filled Avery's dining room as I sat at the mahogany table my late wife Eleanor had given our daughter as a wedding gift. The irony wasn't lost on me. Eleanor had always said that table would bring families together. Tonight, it would tear ours apart. Patrick, my son-in-law of 8 years, was already 3 glasses deep into the wine when the conversation took its familiar ugly turn. His face was flushed, that vein in his forehead pulsing the way it did when he was about to say something cruel. "You know what your problem is, Marvin," he said, pointing his fork at me like a weapon. "You've become a burden, a dead weight dragging everyone down." My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. This wasn't the first time Patrick had attacked me at a family dinner. But something about tonight felt different, meaner, more calculated. Avery sat beside him, cutting her chicken into precise little squares the way she'd done since childhood when she was nervous. She didn't look up, didn't defend me. That silence cut deeper than Patrick's words ever could. "I mean, look at you," Patrick continued, his voice getting louder. "Living in that tiny house, driving that beat-up car, Avery has to worry about you constantly. Do you know how that affects her? How it affects us?" My throat felt dry. The other family members around the table, Avery's cousins, her Aunt Margaret, were pretending to focus on their food, but I could feel their sideways glances, the uncomfortable shifting in chairs. The way conversations die when someone crosses a line nobody wants to acknowledge. "Patrick, maybe we should," Avery started, but he cut her off. "No, Avery, someone needs to say it. Your father is a leech, a pathetic old man who's ruined your life because he can't take care of himself." The words hit me like physical blows. 3 years since Eleanor died. 3 years of trying to rebuild a life without the woman who had been my anchor for 37 years. 3 years of struggling with grief while trying to maintain my dignity, my independence. "He's an embarrassment," Patrick went on, and now he was standing, playing to his audience. "Remember last month when he couldn't figure out how to use the ATM? Or when he got lost driving to the grocery store? He's losing it, and we're all pretending everything's fine." Aunt Margaret made a small sound of disapproval, but she didn't speak up. Nobody did. They just sat there, letting Patrick tear me apart piece by piece. "You want to know what I really think?" Patrick's voice was getting shrill now, the wine making him reckless. "I think Marvin is a selfish old fool who's clinging to his daughter because he's too scared to face reality. He's a dead weight, an anchor dragging us all down to the bottom." My hands were shaking now, not from age or infirmity, but from rage, from the humiliation of being attacked in front of people who were supposed to be family, from watching my own daughter sit there in silence while her husband destroyed what was left of my dignity. "And another thing," Patrick continued, clearly enjoying himself now, "the way he dresses. That old man smell, always complaining about his aches and pains. It's pathetic. Avery could be doing so much more with her life if she didn't have to babysit her decrepit father." That's when something inside me snapped. Not into anger. I was past anger. Into something cold and calculating. Something that had been building for months as I watched my son-in-law's true nature reveal itself. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thick, official-looking, with the law firm's letterhead clearly visible. I set it gently on the table next to my untouched plate. The room went quiet. Patrick stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open slightly. Avery finally looked up from her food, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear. "What's that?" Patrick asked, but his voice had lost its bravado. He was staring at the envelope like it might explode. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting for too long. At 63, I might not be young anymore, but I wasn't the broken-down old man Patrick wanted everyone to believe I was. "That," I said quietly, "is something you should have thought about before you decided to humiliate me in front of my family." Patrick's face went pale. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. None of them could. They thought they knew everything about me, about my financial situation, about my place in this family. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Marvin," Avery said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is that?" I looked at my daughter. Really, looked at her. When had she become this person? This woman who sat silent while her husband eviscerated her father? When had she stopped being the little girl who used to climb into my lap and tell me about her day? "Open it," I said simply. Patrick reached for the envelope with trembling hands. His face was no longer flushed with wine and arrogance. Now he looked like a man who was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. The silence in the room was deafening as he broke the seal and pulled out the documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then widen in shock. His hand started shaking so badly he nearly dropped the papers. "This can't be right," he whispered. But it was right. Every word of it. Patrick's hands trembled as he stared at the legal documents. The color had completely drained from his face, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning running full blast in Avery's dining room. "Read it out loud," I said calmly, settling back into my chair. "I think everyone here deserves to know what it says." Patrick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at Avery desperately, but she was staring at the papers with the same shocked expression. I can't," Patrick stammered. "Then I'll read it," I said, reaching across the table. But Patrick jerked the documents away, clutching them to his chest like they might disappear if he let go. "No," he said quickly. "No, I'll read it." The room was so quiet I could hear Aunt Margaret's nervous breathing from across the table. Avery's cousins had stopped pretending to eat and were openly staring now, sensing that something monumental was happening. Patrick cleared his throat and began reading in a shaky voice. "Last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Holloway, dated March 15th, 2019. Avery gasped. "Mom's will? But we already went through Mom's will. She didn't have much to leave except some jewelry and—" "Keep reading," I interrupted. Patrick's voice cracked as he continued. "To my beloved daughter, Avery Christine Patterson, I leave the property located at 147 Maple Grove Lane, Millfield County, including the main house, guest cottage, and all 37 acres of surrounding land." The silence that followed was deafening. 37 acres in Millfield County. That wasn't just any property. That was prime real estate, worth easily $600,000, maybe more with the recent development boom in the area. "I don't understand," Avery whispered. "Mom never mentioned any property. We went through all her papers after the funeral. There was no property. I had been waiting 3 years for this moment. 3 years of watching Patrick treat me like garbage. Watching my daughter stand by and let it happen. 3 years of being called a burden, a dead weight, a pathetic old man who couldn't take care of himself. Your mother bought that property in 1995, I explained quietly. She never told you about it because she wanted it to be a surprise. She planned to give it to you as a wedding gift, but then she got sick and, well, she died before she could tell you." Patrick was scanning the document frantically now, his eyes racing over the legal language. I knew what he was looking for, and I knew he was about to find it. "There's more," he said, his voice barely audible. "There's a condition." "What condition?" Avery asked, but she was looking at me now, not Patrick, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Patrick's hands were shaking so badly now he could barely hold the papers steady. "The inheritance is contingent upon Avery providing love, respect, and proper care for her father, Marvin James Holloway, for the remainder of his natural life." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I watched as the implications sank in around the table. Aunt Margaret's mouth fell open. Avery's cousins exchanged shocked glances, and Patrick looked like he was about to be sick. "It gets better," I said softly. "Keep reading." Patrick's voice was barely a whisper now. "Should Marvin James Holloway determine that the conditions of love, respect, and proper care are not being met, he has the sole authority to revoke this inheritance and transfer the property to an alternative beneficiary of his choosing." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Patrick's ragged breathing. He set the papers down with shaking hands and stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure, unadulterated terror. "You knew," Avery said suddenly. "You've known about this property for 3 years, and you never said anything." I nodded. "Eleanor made me promise to wait. She wanted to see how you would treat me after she was gone. She was worried that without her around to keep the peace, you might start seeing me as a burden instead of your father. The irony was crushing. Eleanor had been right to worry. Without her gentle influence, without her quiet reminders about respect and family loyalty, Avery had slowly but surely allowed Patrick to poison her against me. "How much is it worth?" Patrick asked desperately, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew it was substantial. "The county assessor valued it at $623,000 last year," I said. "But with the new shopping center going in just 2 miles away, it's probably worth closer to $800,000 now." Patrick made a choking sound. $800,000, more money than he'd probably ever see in his lifetime, and he had just spent the evening systematically destroying his chances of ever getting his hands on it. "Daddy," Avery said, and her voice was different now, smaller. The same voice she'd used as a child when she'd done something wrong and was hoping I wouldn't be too angry. "Daddy, we can talk about this." Patrick didn't mean what he said. He's been under a lot of stress at work and— "Stop," I said quietly. The single word cut through her excuses like a knife. For the first time in 3 years, I was the one with power in this room. I was the one who mattered. "I've been documenting everything," I continued. "Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every time you've let your husband humiliate me. I have a very detailed record of exactly how I've been treated in this family." Patrick's face had gone from pale to green. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, he had gone from feeling superior and in control to realizing that he had just destroyed his family's financial future with his own cruelty. "The property comes with conditions," I said, standing up from my chair. "And as of tonight, those conditions have not been met." I picked up the manila envelope and tucked it back into my jacket pocket. Around the table, my family sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the broken-down old man they'd been mocking was actually the one holding all the cards. "Think about that while you're cleaning up dinner," I said, walking toward the door. "And think about whether $800,000 was worth the satisfaction of calling me a dead weight." I could hear Patrick frantically calling my name as I walked out the front door, but I didn't turn around. For the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, in complete control. The phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail while I sat at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like I did every morning. But the ringing didn't stop. Every 5 minutes, another call. By 7 o'clock, I had 12 missed calls from Patrick and 7 from Avery. I finally answered on the 13th call. "Marvin, thank God." Patrick's voice came through the phone, breathless and desperate. "We need to talk. Last night got out of hand, and I want to apologize. Can I come over?" "No," I said simply. There was a pause. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no, Patrick. You can't come over. You've made your feelings about me very clear." "Marvin, please, I was drunk. I didn't mean any of those things. You know how I get when I've had too much wine. Avery can tell you, I'm not usually like that." I almost laughed. Not usually like that? Patrick had been making snide comments and treating me like an inconvenience for months. Last night wasn't an aberration. It was just the first time he'd done it so publicly. "Actually, Patrick, that's exactly what you're usually like. The only difference is that last night you said it in front of witnesses." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Look, we're family. Family fights sometimes, but we work it out. That's what families do." "Family," I repeated. "Is that what you call it when you tell a room full of people that I'm a pathetic old man who's ruined your wife's life?" I was angry. People say things they don't mean when they're angry. "No, Patrick. People say things they really mean when they're angry. That's when the truth comes out." The desperation in his voice was growing more pronounced. "Marvin, please, $800,000. That's Avery's inheritance. You can't take that away from her because of something I said." "I'm not taking anything away from anyone," I said calmly. "Eleanor's will is very clear about the conditions. If those conditions aren't met, the inheritance is revoked. It's not my fault that you chose to violate those conditions. But I can change. We can change. Just give us another chance." I set my coffee cup down and looked out my kitchen window at the small garden Eleanor and I had planted together 15 years ago. The roses were blooming despite my mediocre care since she'd been gone. Some things survived even when they weren't treated as well as they deserved. "Patrick," I said quietly, "do you remember what you said about me last month when I couldn't figure out the new ATM machine at the bank?" Silence. "You called me a senile old fool. You said it loud enough for half the bank to hear. Do you remember what you said when I got confused driving to the new grocery store location? More silence.
You told Avery that maybe it was time to consider taking my license away, that I was becoming a danger to myself and others. Do you remember that? Marvin, do you remember what you said when I asked for help programming my new television remote?
His voice was barely a whisper. I remember. You said I was hopeless, that technology had passed me by and I needed to accept that I was too old to learn new things. You said it was pathetic watching me struggle with something so simple. I could hear something that sounded like crying in the background. Avery, probably. Every week for the past 6 months, Patrick, you found new ways to make me feel small. New ways to remind me that I'm a burden. New ways to suggest that the world would be better if I just quietly disappeared. I didn't mean, yes, you did. And the worst part is that my daughter sat there and let you do it. My own child watched you tear me down and she said nothing. The crying in the background got louder. Good. Maybe Avery was finally understanding what she had allowed to happen. We can fix this, Patrick said, his voice cracking. We can go to counseling, family therapy, whatever you want. Just don't take away Avery's inheritance because of my mistakes. It's not just your mistakes, Patrick. It's hers too. She made a choice every time she sat silent while you humiliated me. She made a choice every time she agreed with your suggestions that I was becoming incompetent. She made a choice every time she treated me like I was an obligation instead of her father. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Patrick's voice came back, harder now. Desperate people often show their true nature when cornered. You're being cruel, Marvin. Avery loves you. She's always loved you. Love isn't silent, Patrick. Love speaks up. Love defends. Love doesn't sit quietly while someone you care about gets destroyed. So what do you want from us? What do we have to do to fix this? That was the question I'd been waiting for. What did I want? For months, I'd wanted my dignity back. I'd wanted to be treated with respect. I'd wanted my daughter to remember that I was her father. Not just an old man she had to manage. But now I wanted something different. I want you to understand what it feels like to have no power, I said. I want you to understand what it's like to be dismissed and belittled. I want you to know how it feels when the people who are supposed to love you treat you like you're worthless. Marvin, please. I want you to spend some time thinking about whether $800,000 is worth more to you than treating an old man with basic human decency. I hung up before he could respond. The phone rang again immediately. I turned it off. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Patrick standing on my small front porch, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair disheveled. He looked like he hadn't slept. I didn't open the door. Marvin, I know you're in there, he called out. Please, just let me talk to you. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat back down at the kitchen table. Let him stand out there. Let him feel what it was like to be ignored. Marvin, please, I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything I said. You're not a burden. You're not pathetic. You're Avery's father, and I should have treated you with respect. The words sounded hollow even through the door. He was saying what he thought I wanted to hear, but there was no sincerity behind it, just desperation. I'll do anything to make this right, he continued. Anything. Just tell me what you want. What I wanted was my wife back. What I wanted was to turn back time to before Eleanor got sick, before she died, before I became this lonely old man who was dependent on his daughter's charity. What I wanted was to feel like I mattered to someone again, but Patrick couldn't give me any of those things. All he could give me was money he'd never had in the first place, and respect that would disappear the moment he got what he wanted. The knocking stopped after about 10 minutes. I heard his car start up and drive away, but I knew he'd be back. $800,000 was too much money to walk away from. And Patrick was exactly the kind of man who would do anything, say anything, promise anything, to get his hands on that much money. The question was, what would Avery do? Would she stand by her husband? Or would she finally remember that she used to be Daddy's little girl? I had a feeling I was about to find out. 3 days passed before Avery came to see me alone. I was in my small backyard, tending to Eleanor's rose garden, when I heard the gate latch click. I didn't turn around when she approached, just kept deadheading the yellow roses that had been my wife's favorites. Hi, Daddy. The word Daddy hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't called me that in over a year. It had been Dad at best. Marvin when Patrick was around, and she was trying to seem more adult, more sophisticated. Avery. I still didn't turn around. I heard her take a shaky breath behind me. "We need to talk." "Do we?" "Daddy, please, look at me." I set down my pruning shears and finally turned to face my daughter. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing an old sweatshirt I remembered from her college days. She looked like the little girl who used to come to me when she'd had a nightmare. "Patrick's been having panic attacks," she said quietly. "He can't sleep. He can't eat. He keeps saying he's ruined everything." I picked up my shears again and moved to the pink roses. "Has he now?" "Daddy, you have to understand something. Patrick, he's not a bad person. He gets stressed. And when he's stressed, he says things he doesn't mean." I paused in my pruning. "How long have you known about the property, Avery?" The question caught her off guard. I saw her flinch, saw the way her hands clenched at her sides. "What do you mean?" "You heard me. How long have you known about your mother's property in Millfield County?" She was quiet for so long, I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "About 6 months. The pruning shears fell from my hands." 6 months. She'd known for 6 months and she'd said nothing. Worse than that, she'd let Patrick continue treating me like garbage even though she knew I controlled her inheritance. "How did you find out?" "I was going through some of Mom's old papers, looking for her recipe box. I found a copy of the will in her desk drawer." I turned to face her fully now, and I could see the guilt written all over her face. 6 months, Avery. For 6 months you've known that your inheritance depends on how you treat me, and you chose to do nothing. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Help me understand how my daughter could know that her mother wanted her to love and respect her father, and then sit silently while her husband called him a pathetic old fool." Tears were streaming down her face now. "Because I was scared, okay? I was scared that if I told Patrick about the will, he'd try to fake being nice to you just to get the money. I wanted his feelings to be genuine." The irony was staggering. She'd been protecting Patrick's authenticity, and in doing so, she'd allowed his authentic cruelty to flourish. "So you thought it was better to let him show his true colors?" I thought maybe if I gave him enough time, he'd come around on his own. Maybe he'd start to see what I see in you." "And what do you see in me, Avery?" She broke down completely then, sobbing like a child. "I see my daddy. I see the man who taught me how to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. I see the man who held me when Mom died and told me everything would be okay, even though you were hurting just as much as I was." For a moment, I felt my resolve weaken. This was my little girl, the child I'd raised and loved and protected. But then I remembered something. "If that's what you see, Avery, then why have you been treating me like Patrick does?" She looked up at me confused. "What do you mean?" I walked over to my small patio table and sat down heavily. "Last month, when I couldn't figure out the ATM, you said I should probably switch to a bank with simpler machines. You said it in front of Patrick, and you agreed with him when he said I was struggling with technology." Her face crumpled. "Daddy, I was just trying to help. 2 weeks ago, when I got confused driving to the new grocery store location, you suggested maybe I should consider only driving during daylight hours. You said it might be safer. I was worried about you. And last week, when I asked for help with the television remote, you sighed before you helped me. You sighed like I was bothering you with something trivial. Each word was like a knife, and I could see them cutting into her. But she needed to hear this. She needed to understand. You've been agreeing with Patrick's assessment of me for months, Avery. You've been treating me like I'm incompetent, like I'm a burden, like I'm too old to function independently. The only difference is that you've been doing it quietly. That's not, I didn't mean. You did mean it. You've been preparing yourself for the day when you'll have to put me in a nursing home because I can't take care of myself anymore. You've been looking for evidence that I'm declining, that I'm becoming the pathetic old man Patrick says I am." She was sobbing openly now, but I couldn't stop. The words had been building up for months, and they needed to come out. "And the worst part is that you knew. You knew about the will, you knew what your mother wanted, and you still chose to treat me like I was disposable. Daddy, please, do you know what your mother said to me before she died?" I asked quietly. Avery shook her head, still crying. "She said she was worried about what would happen to me after she was gone. She said she was afraid you'd start seeing me as an obligation instead of your father. She said she hoped the property would ensure that you'd always take care of me." I stood up and walked back to the roses. But she never imagined that you'd know about the property and choose to ignore her wishes anyway. I didn't ignore them. I love you, Daddy. I do. I picked up my pruning shears again. Love isn't a feeling, Avery. It's a choice. It's a daily decision to treat someone with kindness and respect. It's standing up for them when others attack them. It's defending them even when it's uncomfortable. I can change. We can change. Patrick and I have been talking, and we want to do better. Have you now? I kept my voice neutral, but something cold was settling in my chest. And what exactly have you and Patrick been discussing? The way she hesitated told me everything I needed to know. We've been talking about maybe having you come live with us. Patrick thinks it would be easier to take care of you if you were closer. Take care of me. Yes, we could convert the spare room into a bedroom for you. It would be perfect. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this house anymore, or driving to the grocery store, or any of those things that have been getting harder for you. There it was. They weren't planning to treat me better. They were planning to control me completely, move me into their house where they could monitor my every move, manage my every decision, and ensure that I couldn't cause any more problems for them. And what happens to this house? Well, we'd have to sell it, obviously, but that's okay because you'd be living with us. I set down the pruning shears and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. When had she become this person? This woman who could stand in my backyard and calmly explain how she and her husband had planned out my future without consulting me. Avery, I said quietly, get off my property. What? You heard me. Get off my property and don't come back. Daddy, you're being unreasonable. No, I'm being clear. You and Patrick have already decided how you're going to handle this situation. You're going to manipulate me into giving up my independence so you can control me completely. You're going to take away everything I have left, my home, my autonomy, my dignity, so you can feel better about collecting your inheritance. That's not what we're doing. Yes, it is, and the fact that you can't even see it makes it worse. I walked toward my back door, then stopped and turned back to her. Your mother left you that property because she wanted you to love me, Avery. Not manage me, not control me, love me. But you can't do that, can you? Because that would mean seeing me as a person instead of a problem to be solved. I went inside and locked the door behind me, leaving my daughter crying in the garden her mother had planted. Through the kitchen window, I watched her stand there for several minutes before finally walking away. That night I called Eleanor's lawyer and scheduled an appointment. It was time to make some changes to that will. Robert Hutchinson had been Eleanor's lawyer for over 20 years. He'd handled our wills, our house purchase, and all the legal paperwork surrounding Eleanor's illness and death. When I called his office, his secretary squeezed me in the next morning. His office smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, the same way it had when Eleanor and I first visited him to draw up our wills 30 years ago. Robert was older now, his hair completely white, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Marvin, he said, standing to shake my hand. I have to say, I was wondering when you might call. Were you now? He gestured for me to sit in the burgundy leather chair across from his mahogany desk. Eleanor was very specific about the conditions in her will. She also mentioned that she was concerned about how Avery might treat you after she was gone. I settled into the chair, noting how it still felt just as comfortable as it had 3 decades ago. Some things remained constant even when everything else fell apart. She was right to be concerned. Robert pulled out a thick file and opened it on his desk. I've been documenting everything, just as Eleanor requested. Every 6 months I've been checking in with neighbors, with your doctor, with people who might have insight into how you're being treated. I felt my eyebrows raise. Eleanor asked you to do that? She was very thorough, Marvin. She loved Avery deeply, but she also knew her daughter's weaknesses. She was worried that Avery might be easily influenced by the wrong person. Patrick. Eleanor had never liked Patrick, though she'd been too polite to say so directly. But I remembered the way her mouth would tighten when he made his little jokes at my expense. The way she'd change the subject when he started talking about how young people had to take care of everything because older people couldn't keep up. What have you documented? Robert put on his reading glasses and flipped through several pages. Well, there's Mrs. Henderson next door. She's mentioned several occasions when she heard Patrick yelling at you in your driveway. Once about your driving, once about some confusion with your mail delivery. I remembered those incidents. Patrick had come over to help with some paperwork and had gotten frustrated when I couldn't immediately find the documents he was looking for. He'd raised his voice, called me scattered and disorganized, made me feel like an incompetent child. There's also Dr. Martinez from your medical practice. He mentioned that Avery has been asking detailed questions about your mental capacity, your memory, your ability to live independently. My stomach clenched. Those conversations had happened without my knowledge. My own daughter had been discussing my competency with my doctor behind my back. And then there's the incident at First National Bank last month. I closed my eyes. The ATM incident. I'd been trying to use the new machine, struggling with the updated interface, when Patrick had loudly announced to everyone in line that I was having trouble with modern technology and needed help with simple tasks. The branch manager, Susan Walsh, filed a report with me. She was concerned about how your son-in-law was treating you in public. A report? Eleanor asked me to establish a network of people who could provide objective observations about your treatment. She wanted documentation in case the inheritance needed to be challenged. I sat back in the leather chair, overwhelmed. Even in death, Eleanor had been protecting me. She'd anticipated exactly what would happen and had put safeguards in place. There's more, Marvin. Robert turned several pages and pulled out a different section of documents. I've also been monitoring Avery and Patrick's financial situation, as Eleanor requested. Why? Because Eleanor suspected that if they ever treated you poorly, it would be motivated by financial desperation. She wanted to know if their behavior was driven by character flaws or by circumstances. He spread several papers across the desk. Bank statements, credit reports, loan documents. They're in significant debt, Marvin. Patrick's construction business has been struggling for over 2 years. They've borrowed against their house twice. Their credit cards are maxed out and they're behind on several payments. I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was seeing. How much debt? Approximately $137,000, not including their mortgage. The number hit me like a physical blow. No wonder Patrick had been so desperate. No wonder Avery had been asking about my mental capacity. They weren't just being cruel, they were being calculating. They need that inheritance, Marvin. Without it, they'll likely lose their house within the next year. I thought about Avery's suggestion that I move in with them, that they convert their spare room for me. It wasn't about love or care, it was about desperation. They needed to ensure they could meet the conditions of Eleanor's will long enough to secure the property. Robert, I said slowly, what are my options? He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Legally, you have complete authority to revoke the inheritance if you determine that the conditions haven't been met. Eleanor's will is very clear about that. And if I revoke it? The property would transfer to the alternative beneficiary Eleanor designated. I frowned. Alternative beneficiary? Robert smiled slightly. Eleanor was thorough, remember? She designated the Millfield County Senior Services Foundation as the backup beneficiary. If Avery loses the inheritance, the property will be sold and the proceeds will fund programs for elderly residents. The irony was perfect. If Avery and Patrick lost the inheritance because they'd treated me poorly, the money would go to help other seniors who might be facing similar treatment. There's something else you should know, Robert continued. Yesterday I received a call from Patrick. What kind of call? He was asking about the will, about the conditions, about whether there were any loopholes or ways to contest Eleanor's wishes. My hands clenched into fists. And what did you tell him? I told him that Eleanor's will is ironclad, and that any attempt to contest it would be expensive and futile. But Marvin, the fact that he's asking these questions tells me he's not planning to change his behavior. He's planning to find a way around the consequences of his behavior. I stood up and walked to Robert's window, looking out at the busy street below. People were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that my world was falling apart and rebuilding itself simultaneously. What would Eleanor want me to do? She made that clear in a letter she left for you. I turned around quickly. What letter? Robert opened his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. She asked me to give this to you only if the conditions of the will were violated. With trembling hands, I took the envelope and carefully opened it. Eleanor's voice seemed to speak to me from the page. My dearest Marvin, if you're reading this, it means our daughter has disappointed both of us. I hoped I was wrong about what might happen, but I feared I was right. You have spent your entire life putting family first, even when family didn't deserve it. It's time to put yourself first. Don't let guilt or obligation trap you in a situation where you're not respected and loved. You deserve better, and I want you to have better. Choose yourself, my love. Choose peace. Choose dignity. I'll understand, wherever I am. All my love, Eleanor. I had to sit down. Even from beyond the grave, Eleanor was giving me permission to prioritize my own well-being over family loyalty. Robert, I said quietly, I want to revoke the inheritance. He nodded and pulled out another set of legal documents. I had the paperwork prepared just in case. Eleanor asked me to make it as simple as possible for you. As I signed the documents that would transfer $800,000 away from my daughter and toward helping other seniors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Relief. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Patrick and Avery wouldn't accept this quietly. Desperate people with nothing left to lose could be dangerous, and I was about to find out exactly how dangerous they could be. The phone calls started before I even got home from Robert's office. 16 missed calls and 23 text messages, all from Patrick and Avery. But now I knew something they didn't know yet. They had already lost. The legal documents were filed on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Patrick and Avery knew. I was sitting in my living room, reading the newspaper Eleanor used to bring me every morning when she was alive, when I heard the car doors slam in my driveway. Through my front window, I could see both of them marching toward my door, their faces twisted with rage and desperation. The pounding started immediately, not knocking, pounding. "Marvin, open this door right now." Patrick's voice was hoarse, probably from the screaming match I imagined he and Avery had been having since they got the call from Robert's office. I didn't move from my chair. Daddy, please, we need to talk about this." Avery's voice was high and panicked. "This is all a misunderstanding." The pounding continued for several minutes. I turned the page of my newspaper and continued reading an article about the new community center being built downtown. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was being funded by donations from local families who cared about their elderly community members. "We know you're in there," Patrick shouted. "Your car is in the driveway. Open this door." I folded the newspaper carefully and walked to my front window. Patrick was red-faced, sweating through his shirt despite the cool autumn weather. Avery stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed against the door like she could force it open through sheer will. I opened the window. "You need to leave my property," I said calmly. Patrick whirled around to face me. "You son of a bitch. You can't do this. That money belongs to Avery." "No, Patrick. That money belonged to Eleanor, and she left very specific instructions about how it should be handled." "You're stealing from your own daughter." I almost laughed. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm simply enforcing the conditions that were clearly stated in Eleanor's will. Conditions you chose to ignore." Avery pushed past Patrick and came to stand under my window. "Daddy, please. We can fix this. We can do better. Just give us another chance." "Another chance to do what, Avery? To pretend you respect me until you get your hands on the money? To move me into your spare room so you can control every aspect of my life? To continue treating me like a burden you have to manage? That's not what we were doing." "Yes, it is. And even if it wasn't, it's too late now. The inheritance has been revoked and transferred to the Millfield County Senior Services Foundation." Patrick let out a roar of rage that probably woke up half the neighborhood. "You vindictive old bastard. You've destroyed us. Do you understand that? You've destroyed your own family." "No, Patrick, you destroyed this family." I just stopped pretending it was still intact. I closed the window and walked back to my chair. The shouting continued for another 10 minutes before I heard their car doors slam again and the sound of them driving away. But I knew they'd be back. They were back the next morning and the morning after that. For a week, they took turns trying different approaches. Patrick would come alone, alternating between rage and fake remorse. Avery would come with fresh tears and childhood memories, trying to guilt me into changing my mind. On the 8th day, they brought reinforcements. I was watering Eleanor's roses when I heard multiple car doors slam. Through my garden gate, I could see Avery's Aunt Margaret, her cousin David, and 2 other relatives I barely recognized. They came in like an intervention team, surrounding me in my own backyard. "Marvin," Aunt Margaret said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we need to talk about this situation with Avery." I continued watering the roses. "What situation is that, Margaret?" "You know exactly what situation. You've taken away Avery's inheritance over a simple misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding. Patrick called me a dead weight, a burden, and a pathetic old man who had ruined his wife's life. He said it in front of all of you, and none of you spoke up to defend me. People say things they don't mean when they're upset. David chimed in. Family is supposed to forgive. I turned off the water hose and faced them. Where was this concern for family forgiveness when Patrick was humiliating me? Where was this intervention when he was systematically tearing down my dignity? You were all there that night, and not one of you said a word. Margaret's mask of sweetness slipped slightly. You're being vindictive, Marvin. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted this. That was a mistake. Bringing up Eleanor was a mistake. Eleanor left specific instructions about what she wanted, I said, my voice turning cold. She wanted her daughter to love and respect her father. She wanted me to be treated with dignity. She wanted me to feel valued as a family member, not managed like a problem to be solved. You're taking this too far, the cousin I didn't recognize said, over some words that were said in anger. Some words? I looked at each of them in turn. For months, Patrick has been treating me like I'm incompetent. For months, Avery has been agreeing with his assessment and planning my future without consulting me. For months, all of you have watched it happen and said nothing. But now that there's money involved, suddenly you all care about family harmony. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're all going to leave my property. You're going to stop calling me, stop showing up at my house, and stop trying to guilt me into changing my mind. The inheritance is gone, and it's not coming back. You'll regret this, Margaret said, her sweetness completely gone now. When you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you, don't come crying to us. I smiled. Margaret, I'm already old. And if I get sick, I'll hire professionals who will treat me with respect because it's their job, not rely on family members who only pretend to care when there's money involved. They left in a convoy of righteous indignation, and I never saw most of them again. 3 months later, I got a call from Robert Hutchinson. Marvin, I thought you'd want to know. The Millfield County property has been sold. $793,000. The foundation is using the money to expand their home care services and build a new senior center. I was sitting in my kitchen, having my morning coffee and reading about the senior center in the newspaper. They were going to name it the Eleanor Holloway Community Center. Thank you for letting me know, Robert. There's something else. Patrick filed for bankruptcy last week. They lost their house. I felt a moment of sadness for Avery, but it passed quickly. She had made her choices, just like I had made mine. 6 months later, I was still living peacefully in my small house, tending Eleanor's garden and reading my morning newspaper. The phone rarely rang anymore, and when it did, it was usually my new friend Margaret Henderson from next door, or Dr. Martinez checking on my health, or someone from the senior center inviting me to join their activities. I had started volunteering at the Eleanor Holloway Community Center twice a week, helping other seniors navigate the challenges of aging with dignity. Many of them had stories similar to mine, family members who saw them as burdens, adult children who were more interested in inheritance than relationship. But the difference was that now I could help them understand they had choices. They didn't have to accept being treated poorly just because the people mistreating them were family. One afternoon, while I was helping an 80-year-old woman named Rose fill out paperwork for home care services, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. My son keeps telling me I should sell my house and move in with him, she said, but I know he just wants to control my finances. I don't know what to do. I handed her a tissue and sat down beside her. Rose, what do you want to do? I want to stay in my house. I want to keep my independence. I want to be treated like an adult, not like a child. Then that's what you should do. You have the right to make your own decisions about your life, regardless of what your son thinks is best for you. She smiled through her tears. It's scary, though, standing up to family. Yes, I agreed, it is, but you know what's scarier? Spending the rest of your life being diminished by people who are supposed to love you. As I drove home that evening, I thought about Eleanor and the gift she had given me, not the money that had never been mine to begin with. The real gift was permission to choose myself, to demand respect, to refuse to accept treatment that diminished my worth as a human being. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the small house Eleanor and I had shared for so many years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My choices, my rules, my peace. For the first time since Eleanor died, I felt truly at home. That night, I wrote a letter to Avery. Not an angry letter, not a vindictive letter, just an honest one. Dear Avery, it began. I hope someday you'll understand that love isn't silent. Love speaks up. Love defends. Love treats people with dignity, even when it's inconvenient. I hope you'll learn that before you have children of your own. Love, Dad. I mailed it the next morning, then went to tend Eleanor's roses. They were blooming better than ever, despite my amateur care. Some things I realized flourish when they're treated with basic respect and attention, just like people. I never heard back from Avery, and that was okay. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to her. At 63 years old, I had finally learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about respect, dignity, and genuine care. And if your biological family can't provide those things, you have the right to find people who can. I was no longer a deadweight or a burden. I was Marvin Holloway, and I deserved better than I had been accepting. Eleanor would have been proud.